our next speaker, I'm very excited to introduce Dr. David Mashulem, Executive Director of Speak for the Trees in Boston. His presentation is entitled Creating an Urban Forestry Nonprofit in Boston. And David co-founded Speak for the Trees in 2018. Trained as a science educator, his past work has focused on ways to increase understanding of the connections between science, equity, culture, and history, and to empower people to be change agents. He holds a PhD in curriculum and instruction from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, degrees in history of science and philosophy of science, is a senior fellow at the Environmental Leadership Program, and co-chairs the Urban Ecology Collaborative, where I have the pleasure to work with him. Please welcome Dr. David Mishwalam to the stage.
All right, thank you. What a great program in Philadelphia, and they presented a couple of months ago now at UEC, and just really, really impressive work. So thank you so much for inviting me to speak today. I'm deeply honored and humbled to be presenting at this year's Alliance for Community Trees Day conference. I think it was Andy Warhol who said that we each have 15 minutes of fame sometime in our lives, and I guess this is mine, right? Speaking in front of a masked audience during a pandemic right before lunch. So with that, I just want to do a quick selfie. And I want to capture this moment. So if you all don't mind saying tree. All right. Awesome. Okay. So today I hope to share with you my thoughts and lessons around the work we're doing in Boston to elevate how people think about and relate to trees. In our work, trees are part of a commitment to building a more just and equitable society, and you've heard that a lot today, that theme. The ideas I will share with you today have been percolating in my mind for some time, and they still feel a little half-baked, so I appreciate your patience and any feedback you might have as I work through them, and perhaps in whatever small way, I hope they generate conversation today and when you return home. But before I begin, I'd like to take a moment, and I want to thank Dr. Lincoln Larson for calling this out, for recognition justice through a land acknowledgement. This is something I often do back in Boston. And I want to acknowledge the native land on which we stand, and that the sacred land where we're meeting today has been a site of human activity for over 13,000 years. I looked it up before I arrived here. This land is the territory, I believe, of the Shawnee and their neighbors, the Cherokee and Chickasaw peoples, who have stewarded this land for hundreds of generations. We're grateful to have the opportunity to meet here today, and we extend our respect to the citizens of these nations and their ancestors who have lived here for over 500 generations, and to all indigenous people. We also affirm that this acknowledgement is insufficient. It does not undo the harm that has been done and continues to be perpetuated now against indigenous people here and across the globe, their land and their water. Our work here today together, in part, is to dismantle the systems and heal the pain from this history. And finally, I just want to thank all the individuals and organizations who have provided me personally. I think I came to my first conference 2 or 3 years ago, and to Boston more largely with the support, ideas, and yes, money, to create something new in our city. I want a deep token of appreciation to Matt Spitzin and Dan Lamb and their team at Arbor Day and Alliance for Community Trees, who have so generously welcomed me into this world of urban forestry. I didn't know it existed. And to all the generous partners at Alliance for Community Trees, the Executive Directors Group especially, who have shared their expertise and knowledge. Also a special thanks to Eric Candela, Molly Henry, and the entire team at American Forests, who have invested so much from the start in our work and vision. And I'm also really humbled and excited to be able to bring along our first full-time staff, Eva and Jarrell, who are here. They've rolled up their sleeves since day one and are doing the real work. So thank you. And finally, if my family is watching, they're probably at school, but if they're watching, they've been my rock and roots since before Speak of the Trees was even an idea. So thank you. So with that, I want to dive right in, and hopefully this will make sense. And I want to talk about the universe for a sec. Because we've learned in school that the universe is made of atoms, right? Been told that they and their constituent parts of protons, neutrons, and electrons are the building blocks of the universe. And perhaps in our world, in our universe, the world is made of trees, right? But I'd like to suggest something different. I'd like to suggest, per the poet Muriel Rukeyser in her poem The Speed of Darkness, that the world is not made of atoms or trees, but of stories. And that our work is defined not by stuff, but by the stories we share with each other. So these stories build relationships between us and ourselves, between us and each other, and between us and our universe. Stories, not atoms, are the building block of our universe. So over the next 10 minutes, I will attempt to walk you through a story in 5 quick chapters of me, of trees, and Speak for the Trees. So, chapter 1, my personal story. I'll be quick here. Here I am, not with a tree, but with a chicken. And I'll begin where I least remember it, my childhood. My parents tell stories of me walking down the street, peering and touching at every leaf. It would take hours to make it just around the block. I was constantly curious, constantly engaged with the natural world as I saw it. And that curiosity extended into my academic career, which was just introduced embarrassingly enough. I entered high school and college committed to being a scientist, but after a couple of years of working at the lab bench, I was disillusioned and stumbled upon the field of philosophy and history of science. I was eager to understand not the facts and theories, but how we come to create knowledge in science and how that knowledge ends up creating us. After a brief time of teaching physics, I returned to graduate studies in history of science and then science education, constantly grappling with the question of what makes knowledge trustworthy and digging into relationships between science, society, history, and democratic values. So it was back in 2016 that I found myself back in the high school classroom teaching physics and a course I created with a colleague on science and society. But I felt stuck in a job I didn't like, surrounded by anxious students and standardized tests. I fell into what I can only describe as a deep depression, a depression that's amplified by a political election cycle in 2016 that feels so distant now, an election cycle that no matter your party affiliation, it felt to me as though the threads of our democracy were unraveling. So I came up with this idea, or a seedling, I should say, of a tree. And at this moment, as I was working on a project with my students, I decided to pursue a project of my own. I saw the effects of digital isolation, an inability for us to connect beyond our, what I call micro bubbles of Facebook and digital media. How could we see each other? How could we move beyond these confined spaces and reconnect to a larger shared vision? And that tree became a way in, not as an environmental object, but as a civic one, as a space for communities to connect, a space where people could gather together, share stories, and see each other again. Oh, and I also found out trees were pretty great at providing a whole bunch of ecosystem services too, right? And then I discovered you all. I discovered Arbor Day, ACT, American Forests, and all the deeply committed groups of tree advocates. And as I continued to work through and develop this organization, Speak for the Trees in Boston, I returned again and again to the idea that the tree serves as a space where people can come together and share their fears and hopes, their dreams for a better future. The tree has remained for us at Speak for the Trees a site of story sharing and expanding horizons, a space of what we called shared humanity. So I don't know how to transition to this, so I'm just going to transition to this idea of patterns. And you'll have to excuse the tangent here, but if you bear with me for a minute, I hope to take you around full circle back to the story. And I like to extend this idea to a mathematical concept that I've long been enamored with called a fractal. Now, a fractal, as you can see here, is a curve, a geometric figure, each part of which has the same statistical character as the whole. So similar patterns sort of occur across scales. In other words, fractals are relations that repeat across scales. So here's an example of a fractal. This is called a Mandelbrot set. And you can see on the left is the zoomed out version, and on the right is the zoomed in version. And it repeats itself across many scales, and here's another fractal. But perhaps the most common fractal that we're all familiar with in our world is a tree with repeating branching fractals, right? Trees, along with things like seashells, are probably the most common example of fractals in nature. And if you look at a tree in the fractal, it begins as a leaf, works its way up to the scale of a tree with its roots, and extends all the way to the scale of a forest. So when we hold a leaf in our hand, we're actually holding the entire pattern of forests. And if you take these mathematical equations and you change them, you get different trees. Different fractals give you different trees. Okay, so what in the world does fractals have to do with urban forestry and NGOs? I want to suggest today that our community work is a type of what I call community fractal building. The relationships we build within people and between people are also relationships that repeat across scales. They're fractals. And what do I mean by this? Just like the physical branching structures seen in our trees, our relationships are fractals that branch out across scales with each other, with our community, with the universe, and with ourselves. But unlike mathematical fractals that have their own numerical patterns, our relationships are built of a different type. They are repeated relational patterns. And this is where I want to drive our conversation today. The relationship rules we make in our smallest actions repeat themselves across many societal scales, and I claim are capable of redefining entire systems of human relationships. And here are the rules that we have at our organization. Approach the world with curiosity. Approach the world with humility. And approach the world with gratitude. And those are our repeated fractal rules in our work. And when our work is defined by these rules, we develop relationships at every level that in turn creates a society that can be kind, empathic, and equitable. The rules of relationships we build on a small individual scale are rules of relationships that work themselves through all of society. Now, you can quibble with these rules, and I welcome a conversation of what those 3, 4, or 5 rules might look like for us and our society and our shared work together, and I'd be curious to hear your thoughts. So, how do we do this work? How do we actually incorporate these values, these fractals, into our work? A tree does fractal work through a combination of genetics, photosynthesis, and growth. How do we find ways to generate a pattern in the connective fractal of relationships? So this is where I like to go back to where we began, with stories. Sharing stories provide us tools for empathy and understanding. They refract our values of curiosity, humility, and gratitude. In short, through storytelling, we exhibit and actualize our values. In our work at Speak for the Trees, and I hope one day to create a website where we can actually share all this work. We're developing a library. Trees serve as a tool for developing relationships. They allow us to see each other, to hear each other, to share in the now with each other. And through these stories, we fashion a new universe. Because, let's remember, the universe is not made of atoms. It is made of stories. Thank you.